All right, well, thank you, Taylor. Appreciate that introduction. And I'm Courtney Kohler. I'm a project director for instructional design and technology at the Community Action Partnership. We are bringing this webinar to you today from our Center of Excellence at the National Community Action Partnership. And so what we're going to be talking about is kind of taking a look at our overall data strategy as organizations. So starting out, we're going to talk a little bit about culture and talking about what is your culture like in relation to data. Are you data centric? Then we'll talk about data strategy. So no matter where you're at as far as your data culture, how do you then build on that to develop an overall strategy around data? So we'll talk a little bit about collection, analysis, and communication of data, but we're not going to go real far into the weeds on those topics today. But we do have some additional training resources that do go a little bit deeper in those areas that we'll share towards the end. And then we do have a couple of follow-up webinars to this that'll be happening later on in the summer. So this is somewhat of a series of webinars that's building into talking a little bit more about communicating data, sharing data through dashboards, and then also talking about just telling the story of community action and of what various funding sources are doing for community action agencies and for the customers that are being served. And then we also have some additional training materials, and I'll mention this towards the end again, but around measurement tools that are coming towards the end of the summer as well. So kind of packaging a lot of data training and resources for you over the next couple of months. But what we're doing today, we're kind of taking this approach to like zoom out and really think about what's our overall approach and strategy with data. And then hopefully kind of taking some of those more detailed pieces to build in as we go through content over the next few months. So whenever we're talking about a data-centric culture, these are some of the elements that we might think of. They're not all of them. There might be other elements or features that are shown through the organization. But some of these things that are listed here on your screen might describe what you might see in an organization that is data-centric. So you might see that management of data collection, analysis, and follow-up is being done. That management based on data in your agency means not just making decisions, but also doing follow-up and further analysis to create meaning. And another one is that you might see that the organization has established policies and procedures related to data if you're more data centric. And we do actually have in some of the training resources that I'll talk about later, we do have kind of a guide to data policy and procedures that can help your organization draft those if you don't have them currently or you're looking to build upon what you have. We also, you might think of an agency that's data-centric doing database decision-making. So there's lots of different ways that people say this. So it might be, data-driven or fact-driven, information-based, evidence-based, evidence-informed. But basically, all that means is that we're making decisions directly connected to what the data is telling us. And so that's really where we want to be, and that's how we want to make sure we're using our data. And then also, do we have database communications? So data-centric organization would have communications that are based on data that are telling the story of what your agency is doing, of your results, and that there's communications that are specifically based on that. And also even thinking about kind of what your organization's overall communication strategy is and how that might tie back to data in your community as well as data in your organization as far as things like target audience, preferred methods of communication, that sort of thing. And within an organization that is data-centric or that is shifting to a more data-centric culture, the role of leadership is really critical. And so A good leader can really create a good climate that fosters excellence in providing service as well as producing results and outcomes. You can insist on and model data use as a part of the organizational culture. So a good leader would exemplify that as well. Acknowledging successes is also very important for leadership to do with a data-centric culture, whether it be success of staff or just success of the results of the agency. And then also, leaders should be somewhat data savvy also, so they can appropriately guide discussions and actions. And what we mean by this is, that doesn't mean that leaders need to be, any sort of mathematician or an expert in statistics or analysis necessarily, but it's all about, kind of having this good instinct related to data and the ability to then make sure that data is being used in appropriate ways, and kind of, doing what we're talking about today, really considering this overall data strategy for the organization. So that's a really, those things are really important roles of leadership in having this data-centric culture. And, especially if your organization is looking to shift to more of a data-centric culture, that's going to take some change. Any kind of culture shift creates change. I know, many of you might be thinking, change has been all around us over the past year and beyond that too. So we're kind of in a constant state of shift and change right now, I feel like. But, whenever we're talking specifically about this kind of data-centric culture, there's going to have to be some intentional shifts related to that in the organization. And so leaders would want to be explicit about how data influences decision making. So giving clear examples about that, about instances in which decisions are being made based on data that's been collected. Also being clear about who the stakeholders are, internal and external, and how each engages with data. Also articulating measurable outcomes that can be found in data and analytics initiatives. So making sure that we're talking about, the programs and services that are producing measurable outcomes, the targets that are being set, how those are being achieved, and then also looking out into our community initiatives that we might be doing and collaborations, and thinking about, how do we talk about the outcomes that we're working to achieve, and then the ones that we're also actually achieving in the organization as well. And there may even be time, sometimes in Roma training, we talk about, there's positive change, there's kind of neutral change. And then sometimes we don't achieve what we necessarily, wanted to or thought we would. But then how are we using those instances as well to then learn from and improve our programs and services, and kind of have this overall approach to continuous quality improvement. And so that's one thing that we want to make sure that we're doing, is not looking at things like this or lack of achievement as failure, but as really an opportunity to continuously improve and try maybe small change efforts to, instead of great big overhauls, to get, where we're wanting to be. And then we also want to make sure that, as leaders influencing this cultural change, that we communicate how data influences the work. So making sure that we're making those connections for other staff, for people in the community as well, so that people can see how that the data is actually influencing decision making and the work that's being done as a result. And then these are some examples of some clear messages that can be sent to staff to make sure that that this is being communicated and modeled throughout the organization. So one idea is to create a specific position within the organization for someone that would really be in charge of coordinating and managing the data policies. So you might not have one person that's their primary role, but maybe you have identified someone in your organization that's really good at kind of this process improvement, being able to kind of create systems and policies and procedures. And then so that person might have a natural strength, and maybe some of their job duties relate to, data collection, and things like that. And so that would be an accurate, a good person to, take on that as a responsibility. And so that person might assure that data quality is, kind of up to par. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those data quality attributes here in a moment. And they also might assist in the flow of data analysis points to make sure that it's getting to the right people. So those key decision makers within the organization. You also might consider editing staff job descriptions more as a whole to include what each position's role is in collection of data, storage of data, retrieval, aggregation, so compiling it, as well as analysis of data. Because really, whenever you think about the staff within your organization, everyone has something to do with data. And so being able to more clearly articulate that for staff and help them see where they fit in that process can actually be very helpful. And so you might identify specific elements of data for which people are responsible, or kind of where they fit within that process and what their role is as far as, whether they collect it, analyze it, or multiple. And then also, simply providing recognition for work well done in relation to data. So even noticing small things, that people are using data to make a decision, just kind of more on a regular basis, or that maybe somebody identified an area for, kind of that continuous quality improvement cycle to kind of test out to improve a program. So little things like that, or achievement of an outcome, or something, that kind of thing should be recognized and kind of shown that that is something that is appreciated and acknowledged within the organization as a job well done. So kind of that positive reinforcement, I guess. So these are just some of these we've already talked a little bit about, but these are some different ways that we can foster a data-centric culture. Leadership influence is a big piece of this. It's kind of a core component, but there's people that all levels of the organization can participate in shifting to more of a data-centric culture. So whenever I talk about, leaders having this influential role, if you're not an executive or on the leadership team, that's not your opportunity to kind of tune out, because there's ways that people can lead at all levels of the organization as well. And you might be a leader within your program. And so those sorts of leaders are very much important as well, because it does take the whole organization, even though there does need to be kind of that champion at the top. So there's, the position creation, or, shifting, kind of being more articulated about job duties and job descriptions. We already talked about that. But, even communicating ethical considerations of data collection and analysis. So making sure that we're being ethical and confidential with data, identifying and communicating the value of data-driven decision-making. We talked a little bit about that one. And then also just leading by example. So, if you're wanting to see, more evidence of a data-centric culture, anyone at any level of the organization can kind of, provide that example to others up and down and across the organization. So those are just some ideas to kind of take with you to help foster that culture. But we do know that it comes with challenges. So, finding time to review data and reflect on what it means, that can be time consuming. Also understanding the significance of data analysis as a tool to make improvements rather than just reporting. So I think sometimes, we get such in a mindset of what we need to get done for a requirement or a deadline. And then we're often moving on to the next thing because, there is a lot to do. And so making sure that we are taking that moment to step back and understand that significance of the data analysis that can have that trickle effect over time as well. And then also, again, taking, that time and that mindset to really see the big picture. So as a staff, these are some things that we've actually heard from staff in the network that have, expressed what the challenges are around data collection, analysis, culture. And it can be challenging to really, stop and see the big picture rather than just focusing on, if it's a frontline worker, maybe the customers that they serve or the specific program that they work within, because the overall organization, in thinking about the mission and the community needs and things like that, all of that stuff is very much connected. Then also knowing what to do after the analysis. So determining what actions to take, how to make changes when needed improvement is identified. So there's various steps to, this overall kind of process of a data strategy. And a lot of times kind of within the steps, there's times when you can get stuck. And so making sure that we're bridging those connections between collection and analysis, from analysis to utilization of the data, for decision making, and then even taking it to that step further of sharing and communicating that as well, and then even fostering that back into reassessment as well, and kind of improvement for the next time around of collection, analysis, etc. Also knowing what data elements to collect and analyze. This is an ongoing learning process. So there's really no way that you're going to get it 100% right the very first time, because oftentimes when you analyze, you often find what gaps or missing information that you might have that you figure out that you need to then collect the next time around, or you maybe need to collect it in a better way. So of course there are going to be specific elements that are required to be collected, but the data analysis process can really help you to see, to kind of go beyond the requirements. What is data that's just simply helpful for decision making and continuous improvement. And then also understanding benchmarks and how they're applied. So being able to utilize kind of your point in time assessment of where you're at to help measure progress over time. And so also understanding that kind of identifying your benchmarks isn't not to get stuck in wherever you're at currently, if it's not the best place, but really how to just use whatever that place might be as a benchmark for improvement. Then also determining if the organization is really collecting the right data. So is it a really reliable indicator of success or performance? And so that's, again, as you're determining what data you need, you can then take that back into the next cycle of data collection, analysis, etc. And then also feeling confident in your data aggregation analysis skills. This is something that I think actually a lot of people really struggle with, because we think that we have to be, formally schooled in this type of, in data analysis, that we have to have some level of, knowledge of how to use certain tools like SPSS or Excel, and all of that stuff can be very helpful. That education is helpful, the tools are helpful, but analysis and aggregation is really a little bit more about just being able to look at the data, manipulate it in ways that make it more meaningful. So compiling it, organizing it, categorizing it, and then also asking questions of your data. So if you really don't know where to start with analysis, really just focusing in on asking questions can be a really good place to start. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to more detail on analysis. But those are just some of the challenges that we hear, and I'm sure that many of you have additional challenges or might resonate with some of these as well. So now I want you all to take a moment as you're thinking about the challenges and where you might want to be as an organization, no matter where you're at within your organization, what role you play. I want you to take a moment just to do a quick assessment of your agency. So these, you see the bulleted statements here, and just on a scrap piece of paper, note where you feel like your agency is at based on where you agree with this. So, staff members are comfortable talking about data. Do you strongly agree that your agency has, as a whole, staff members are, very comfortable talking about data, or, maybe not? So see where you rate on each of these, whether you agree, mostly disagree, or strongly disagree. And then I want you to count up your score. So in the end, if you're at, there's 7 bullets there. In the end, if you're at a score of 28, that would be the highest. That means that you're probably a pretty data-centric organization. But then if you're a little bit further down, more towards 7, so your range is going to end up being between 28 and 7, then there might be some areas to improve upon. And so your scores will kind of guide you to where some areas might be. So I'll give you just like a moment or so, maybe 30 seconds or so to kind of jot down what you think. If you want to share your score in the chat, you can. You don't have to. But we are kind of interested in if people, feel like their organization is mostly data-centric or not so much. So after we do this assessment, we're going to talk a little bit about strategy and what to do next. So you can send it just privately to me, or you can send it to, I think you can send it to everyone as an attendee sometimes. Okay, I'm seeing several scores coming in, so that's helpful. A lot of kind of like mid-range, which is, very much expected. So we're seeing ranges from between 15 and 20 is where a lot of people seem to be. And one person said 3. So I don't know if you gave yourself zeros on some of them. Okay. Yeah, so like 15. Okay. All right, so one of our higher scores is about 21 or so. So that's pretty good. Means you had probably mostly agree on a lot of them, or on average. All right, so great. Thank you all for doing that. We got 23, so that agency sounds pretty data-centric. All right, well, thank you all, and hopefully this kind of gives you an idea of, these are maybe some places to start for your organization. So if you feel like, you scored pretty low, like or you more disagreed, with maybe the one around, using data to make decisions, maybe that's like an area that you can start to provide training on, or talk about a little bit more in your organization about how you can start to build that up a little bit more. I see more scores coming in, so good. Thank you for doing that. All right, so now we're going to talk about data strategy. And so we don't want to just leave you with, here's where your organization is at, but we want to kind of give you some thoughts on where to go next with this, and really think kind of big picture about the data strategy for your organization. Some of these questions that you can ask of your organization. First of all, do you know what data can do for your organization? So is everyone kind of clear on what that is? Because that's going to really help guide your strategy. Another thing you can do is also look at your mission statement as well as your needs assessment, and identify ways that the data that you collect provides information that matters to those two things. So obviously with your needs assessment, you're probably collecting community and individual level data about the people that you serve, or the people within your community, to identify those high priority needs, and so to really help to guide the programs and services. So community action is really built on data-driven decision making, when you really think about it, because our model is all about doing that needs assessment to design the programs and services that needs to be offered by the community action agency. So we want to be able to draw those connections, and are those it's the data that we're collecting as a part of the needs assessment. Is it like helping to achieve your mission? Is it helping to plan your programs and services? So are you able to kind of draw those lines from the data to these processes that you're doing? And then also, do you have questions that you want data to answer for you? So what are those questions maybe in your organization that you've asked over time that just simply don't have answers? And so you might be able to collect some data in your organization from your customers. Maybe it's internal with agency data, operational type data that could help to answer some of those unanswered questions a little bit better. And so what you want to do whenever you're thinking about this data strategy is you want to start with the data or start by working out what you want to know rather than starting with what data you could or should access or collect. So you want to start first of all with what do you really want to know, and that can help guide your strategy. So some of the benefits of having a data strategy, it can help to improve your processes, so it can help to streamline your processes, make them more efficient. It can also improve your data privacy and integrity, as well as quality of your data. So it can help to mitigate those issues if you have them, which, I mean, really, to be honest, we probably all have them at some level. And then also it gives you a deeper understanding of the community needs, what's working, what's not working in your organization, as well as the agency capacity to then carry out the plans that you have set. And then also, what are some of our goals with a data strategy? Why would we want to, what is kind of our end result that we're seeking out of this? And so, a data strategy can really help to foster innovation within an organization. So if we're continually looking at our data, we're using our data for decision making, then we're going to be kind of in that mindset of continuous quality improvement and identifying ways to really kind of push past the norm and be creative. It can also address the needs of customers, which is really one of our primary goals in community action, but also thinking about both internal and external customers. So always not forgetting about our staff as internal customers, but of course, our external customers as well. And then it can also help to manage risk and better meet regulations as well. And then lastly, your data strategy can work to influence public perceptions. So an example of this is whenever you are, a lot of you might be working on your annual report right now, and so you're thinking some of this might be like, well, it's not. We want to get past thinking it's just about the report, because part of what we want to do with data in collecting it and sharing it is making sure that we're telling that story. And so overall, the data strategy should help to influence the public perceptions about poverty, about the work of community action, about the impact of certain funding sources, things like that. And then we have here some components of a data strategy. So these kind of boil down, there's a lot, if you research this, there's lots of components out there that you can kind of build these in, but these are kind of 4 that we boiled it down to. And really they're all interconnected. So some of them you might be looking at like habits and systems, those are maybe a little bit similar, but they all kind of overlap with one another. And so priorities, of course, that's getting clear on what do you want to know? What are you seeking to achieve through your data strategy? And kind of what are those overall goals, like we talked about on the previous slide, for your particular organization? And then it's also about another component, the people that you have and the roles that they play in the overall data strategy. So whatever their role might be in the collection of data, analysis, aggregation, telling the story with the data, each person in the organization touches some part of the data strategy. And so those people are really the ones that are helping to carry out the strategy in alignment with the priorities. And then the habits are really those day-to-day activities that are taking place on a regular basis that help to make the strategy work. And so those habits are going to be really important to making sure that the priorities are met. The people are, of course, are the ones that are carrying out those regular habits. And then all of this kind of fits within this overall system. So what systems do we have in place, whether it be databases or processes that help to kind of provide the framework for this data strategy within the organization? And so these are kind of the four things that you want to think about when you're designing a data strategy to make sure that it can work the most efficiently and effectively for your organization. So some of the key things that you'll want to determine, especially as you're looking at your priorities, are, first of all, what do you want to know? And I've already said that a few times. And I think Barbara Mooney's on this call as well, but she always talks about that. That's kind of one of her soapboxes. And also what data will be needed in order to answer your questions. And then why is that information important? So why do we prioritize that? And then what are we going to do once we find out what we wanted to know? Obviously it's probably going to bring up additional questions. Did that meet our expectations or not, and why? So really starting out with some of these questions can help you to determine your priorities within your data strategy. We also want to, this kind of goes back a little bit to the culture aspect of things, but really changing our mindset around how we think about data. I think oftentimes we, because of the busyness of things and the requirements, we kind of get into a mindset of collecting data for the report. And so, as some of you might be doing your CSBG annual report right now and your CARES report, you probably are just looking at the finish line to try to get it done. But we also want to make sure, that beyond, meeting those requirements and doing the report, or multiple reports for multiple programs probably, we collect data to help manage and support the agency's programs and services. And then that's what helps us determine if we're making a difference in our customers' lives and in their communities. So really it is much more about a bigger picture mindset rather than getting focused in on the report. And so one kind of process and overall framework we use in community action for this is results-oriented management and accountability, or ROMA. Hopefully many of you have heard of this on the call. We've had maybe some training in it, but we do have additional training if you're wondering what ROMA is. But I think that, we've, especially over the last several years, I think ROMA training has become much more widely available and people know about ROMA. But this is kind of the overall framework of it, going from assessment to planning, implementation, achievement of results, and evaluation. And there's data aspects to each part of this cycle. And so this can kind of help to provide a framework for your data strategy in your organization as well, identifying what types of data are included in which pieces of the process. And then also considering the fact that although it does go around, in a cycle, that's more clockwise, it also can go in reverse. It goes across the cycle because each of these pieces are very much interconnected. So they're not only tied to the piece before it, but across that cycle to really make it, effective for the organization. And so there's also similar kind of misconceptions about ROMA. And so a lot of times, people tie Roma, to the report, to the NPIs. And it's not just about reporting. Also, Roma is not a program or a service. So it's not just a, something that we do, but it's really that complete management and accountability process that is focused on results and what's achieved by the agency's activities. And it's also really just a way of providing a framework for continuous quality improvement too. So if you look at the Roma cycle, it's very much similar to these other cycles that we see out there, related to CQI, quality management, all of those sorts of things. But this is kind of our framework for community action. So really this, using kind of the Roma framework and what we've kind of talked about, so far, this is kind of how we can get from data to creating, turning that into information and knowledge for decision making. So in talking about this relationship between data, information, knowledge, just want to remind you that, and some of you may have seen this before if you've been in some of our other trainings, but data by itself is just raw data, and so it's really just the facts that are observed, measured, collected, aggregated. But you really have to do something with the data, and it only becomes information for decision making once it's become analyzed in some way. And then knowledge is really derived from the interaction of information and experience on the topic. So then that's really where it's most useful. And so one kind of, I guess, real world example of this is, maybe not real world to some of you, but if you wanted to climb a mountain, you might look at some of the data related to Mount Everest. So it might be the height of the mountain, the location of it, the climate, the terrain, but those elements themselves are not necessarily useful until you turn them into information. So you might combine those data elements to understand what the conditions are on the mountain. So you have to compare them with each other, layer them on top of each other, kind of in your mind. And then you might be able to identify what would it kind of be like to climb that mountain. And then knowledge would really be that step further in understanding how the information is related to that actual task of climbing and surviving, climbing that mountain. So, it really is that kind of that stair-step approach to get to where you want to be with knowledge rather than just the raw data. So the data strategy is really what's going to help you get from data to knowledge. So we're going to talk a little bit about just some considerations related to data collection, analysis, and communicating your data. When we have additional training materials that go further into, really what type of data you want to make sure you're collecting, what parts of the process, from what sources, all of that sort of thing. But today we just want to provide you with some higher level kind of considerations. So you want to think about, whenever you're starting to collect data, and really you have an ongoing collection of data, why are the data elements being collected? So it's going to probably tie back to something for a report or multiple reports, for managing the agency, measuring staff performance might be another reason. You also might be wanting to measure impact and results. Hopefully is definitely on your list. And there might be other reasons as well. And then, of course, like I said earlier, you might identify over time additional reasons that you might need to collect data or additional data that you need to collect. Then also, who are the stakeholders or interested parties with your data? And then also, with the stakeholders and interested parties, if it's external, you might be looking at funders, elected officials, the public, the community at large. And then with internal stakeholders, you're probably thinking more about board and staff. And so all of these people, as you're thinking about who needs to be involved, you know, who's going to need the information once it's collected, analyzed, etc. That's going to be a consideration for data collection. So then also then who will be those recipients of the data. And sometimes, you know, we do leave staff out of this picture, you know, that sometimes even especially frontline workers are overlooked as far as receiving back some of the data or some of the analyzed data. And the frontline staff, it can actually be really useful for them to get kind of a picture of this data, you know, as they go through the process of, you know, serving customers, so that they can improve their own work and how they're serving customers as well. So then there's also a couple of different types of data. So we have both quantitative data and qualitative data. Of course, types of data goes, you know, beyond these, but these are kind of two buckets of data that really most data really fits into. So we have quantitative, which really looks at the numerical or statistical data. Some examples of this might be like demographics, counts and rates. So how many people are in poverty? What is the, you know, rate of homelessness in a community? Things like that. And this data is really what we call secondary. So it's coming not directly from a source, but kind of in a secondary manner through like aggregation of, you know, numbers and things like that. And this is kind of data really confirms. So it works to, that's really the purpose of this kind of data, is confirms like what are the numbers telling us about the issues. So what are kind of those numerical facts about what is happening? And then qualitative data is really about the narratives and the perceptions. So oftentimes that can be based on quantitative data, or just kind of what people feel and what's happening in a community or within an agency or whatever it might be. And then, you know, some examples of this might be community resources or maybe assets within the community, because that's not necessarily numerical data that you can pull together unless it's, you know, simply how many of something. And then it also might be like barriers to accessing services. So those are going to be more narrative type data. And this is really primary data. So it comes directly from the source, directly from the customer or the community member that's experiencing it. And this type of data, the purpose of it is really to explore. So it goes a little bit deeper than those numbers. It kind of explores maybe the why or the perception around that as well. So then thinking about other kind of types of data and what to do with data. There is also program data that we have in our organizations that as we're kind of preparing this data for analysis, it's good to think during the collection phase with data of like, what are we really going to be doing with it later, or how can it be useful for us? And so we might want to develop formats for aggregation and analysis prior to data collection efforts so that the data can be easily managed. Once it comes in, it can be easily organized over time so that, you know, later on down the process, we're not just looking at all of this data and wondering what to even do with it. And really these kind of things help our data collection efforts to have more of a purpose. And so, you know, if we're starting out with more of a purpose around data collection, we're formatting it in a way from the beginning, we're able to kind of look at data elements across different programs, or, you know, whatever data elements might be required by various funders. We can maybe streamline collection and analysis in, you know, in the forefront. And then also, if we're able to kind of zoom out, you know, as we're kind of creating our kind of our overall strategy around, you know, data collection itself, we can, you know, create kind of like a data map or a flow chart that shows how information flows across the organization. So this can actually help to determine if a given software application or database is working well for you, or what you want it to do for your organization. And then also can help, like we were talking about with the data strategy components, it'll help to achieve the priorities that you have set. It can help to put people in the right places in your overall process. And then it can also help to build in those habits over time to help the overall system really work for the organization. And another thing that we want to talk about in relation to collection is the 4 data quality attributes. And so you see them here on your screen: complete, timely, reliable, accurate. And we'll go into just a little more detail on what these mean. And so, because sometimes these are a little bit misunderstood. Reliable is really about collecting the same data element over and over. No change in the process of collecting this item, so it's about consistency, repeatability. And then accurate, it's the data entered is the actual true value. So is what you're measuring what you think you're measuring? And is that actual value of the element being measured, not just like an approximation or a sample? And then timely, I'm kind of going in a reverse order here, but timely is really about the data being collected and entered into a system, like at the time of encounter, ideally, or, whatever that formal schedule is for collecting and entering the data. And then complete, is all the required data actually collected? So do we have gaps in our data? Do some clients or customers have certain data elements that others don't? An example here is the demographic data. How much missing data might we have? And so one thing you might think about here is, especially as you might be completing annual reports at this time, with the kind of the current state of how, we had a pandemic, we're still in a pandemic. And there was additional funding that was a blessing, but it was also, kind of sudden. Community action agencies were pivoting very quickly, using this funding, responding to the needs in the community. And so, this data collection process had to be, really had to come about on the spot, essentially. And people didn't know, in the very beginning, what exactly maybe they needed to be collecting for the report, because, just with the time and limitations of that, we weren't sure yet. So whenever we look at these data quality attributes, you might be thinking, well, gosh, I feel like we're maybe not quite there this time. And these are great measures, but sometimes they are context dependent. So we want to make sure we have these. But we also want to make sure that even if we don't have them tied to a specific report at one given time, that we make sure that we're kind of using that continuous quality improvement, first of all, to get to where we're meeting these 4 data quality attributes. But also quality is tied to what we want to use our data for. And so the data can still have quality, even if it's maybe not up to par for, this, specific report. But we can also still use our data and get it up to quality to use it, for other storytelling, to show, your community or your funders or your legislators how CARES Act dollars have been spent in your agency by using your data with a context of stories. So some of it depends on the ultimate goal. And, kind of also looking at, making sure you're not just checking boxes for a report versus making sure you're telling a more complete story for your organization. So that's one thing to just kind of note on this when we're talking about data quality, if you're having anxiety looking at some of these different attributes. All right, so preparing for analysis. this is where we really want to turn the data into information and knowledge. And whenever we talk about this, and this is, we've really kind of hammered this home, I think, but our data cycle, we collect it, we analyze it, we turn that analysis into insight, and then we use it for action. And then, of course, this arrow between action and collection, I think, is also really important too, because that's where we kind of have this mini analysis of, okay, we created this insight to take this action, but what else do we need to know for next time? So what data was maybe missing that would be more helpful in our decision making next time? Where do we need to improve as far as our data quality, maybe? Having more complete data, having more reliable or accurate data. And then how can we, take that back into the next data cycle to make sure that we're collecting the right information, but that we also have the right process to collect it, because a lot of times the data quality can tie to the process that you're using for data collection, not just what data elements are you collecting. So those are some important factors to keep in mind with this data cycle. And good analysis, really starts before data collection. So if you're able to think about this overall data strategy, then you're likely going to be thinking ahead about data analysis before you get into, the weeds of data collection. And that can help to inform what data you need to collect for the best analysis and decision-making experience later. So you first want to know your goals. So you can see how this really ties back to kind of those components of data strategy as well. You also want to identify your timeline and capacity. So making sure that you're creating space and identifying staff strengths. We can't always control when reports are due and things like that. But making sure that we are creating space, maybe after a report is submitted or at a certain point in the data process, to make sure that we're, taking some time to really spend with the data, because that's where the analysis happens. If we're not creating time and space with the data, then we likely aren't able to really get to a point of analysis. And then also, when thinking about staff capacity, it's not just about who has time to do it, but who has a strength in this area? Who's really good with numbers? Who just has kind of this instinct around data and using it for decision making and like picking out, good insights with, data that we have. And so really kind of looking at your staff and identifying, who has those strengths that they might be able to lend to this process. And that doesn't necessarily mean, giving someone a whole nother job duty, but just including them in this process to make sure that their skills are utilized. And usually that can go a long way with staff development even as well. So starting with good design is another one. Again, your data collection elements or practices, only take you so far, but the instruments that you're using are really important as well. So whether it be your intake form, your surveys with, customers or even with staff, making sure that you have the right instruments that have the right information to collect, and the instruments are clear, they're concise, they, all of those kind of considerations too, because that can really tie to your data quality as well. So that's another good consideration in the forefront of things. And then as you do get to that, time and space that you've created for data analysis, preparing the data before you start the analysis. So where people often get overwhelmed is whenever they're looking at this like large array of data and they just have no idea where to start. And so again, like I said in a few slides ago, if you're developing formats in the beginning to like put your data into that are maybe organized, so by categories, maybe there's a way that you can put it together to help start to aggregate some of the data, which is basically like compiling and summarizing it. And then also if the format kind of lends to starting to synthesize it as well and starting to look for patterns, essentially is what that means. So if you're able to kind of, start to prepare the data before you get to, really that analysis process, it'll make the analysis much smoother and less overwhelming as well. And then some of our basic analysis techniques, again, you don't have to be a statistician or a mathematician to do data analysis. It can really all start with some very basic techniques such as asking questions. And if you don't know where to start, two really good questions. The first one is why. You can just start with why. Another good question is, is this data describing what we thought would happen? Did we do what we thought we'd do? And so those kind of questions can really help get you started. Within some of our other trainings that I'll share towards the end, we have a more full list of questions that you all can start with your agency. Counting. Counting and aggregating numbers, that is a form of analysis as well, because then being able to see how the sum of things add up, and then you can start to compare things as well, whether you're comparing data across programs, or maybe you're comparing data across counties within your service area, demographics. Maybe it's your local to state to national, rates of poverty, rates of homelessness, things like that. That comparison and that counting can tell you a lot about what's happening. And then examining trends. So looking at your data over time, preferably 3 years or more, with trends. And so that can also tell you a lot. And so if you're able to use these different techniques, just one of them, or especially layering them with each other, you're really going to start to get into the thick of analysis and your data is going to start telling you things. And then also one thing I like to tell people too is don't be afraid to use your own experience and knowledge in the analysis process as well. Especially like frontline staff who are hearing, feedback and maybe barriers, struggles, issues directly from the customers. They're going to be able to provide context to the data. And so that's another thing that I think is, as we talked about data, information, and knowledge, that experience piece between information and knowledge is really important as well. So not being afraid to use your own experience and expertise in that, as long as it's founded on something. And then also tools for visualization can be really helpful in analysis, whether it might be mapping data, so you can get kind of a visual representation of what's happening maybe across your service area. Charts and dials can help to show comparisons or, like even just number of people served in each program, things like that. And then dashboards and scorecards can kind of help to show that progress over time as well. So that visual aspect can be really helpful for many of us to kind of see the visual of the data and understand it a little bit better. So then communicating the data. So I'm going to go through some of these communication slides somewhat quickly, but of course we'll provide you with the PowerPoint and the recording of this webinar. But I think the main thing I want to talk about here is that we want to make sure we use the data. And of course I've been saying that probably this whole presentation in various ways. But the data that we collect shouldn't just stop with collection. It shouldn't just stop with the report. The needs assessment shouldn't just stop with submitting it to the state CSPG office and then sit on a shelf. We want to make sure that we're utilizing the data past that and communicating it and thinking about who needs to know, what do they need to know, and then how can we continue to use the data and analysis for decision making, continuous quality improvement, for telling our story, generating new funding, whatever it might be, advocating for our customers. So why? First of all, we want to educate people. We want to tell the community action story locally, statewide, regionally, nationally. We also want to be able to advocate for customers, like I said, and then develop partnerships because those are really critical to doing the work. We can't do all of this ourselves. Who needs to know? Board of directors, of course, very key stakeholders, community members, including customers, but we want to take it broader than just the people we serve. Community action, so the community action network as a whole, but also the one group of people we really don't want to forget is your own staff. It can actually be, whenever we talk about staff training and development, simply providing some of this data back to them can be a really good learning experience, really help to improve their performance on the job, especially if they know how to use it as well. Local funders, even regional or national funders as well, state and federal funders, if depending on grants and things that you're going after, elected officials, so that they can use the data for decision making, and news media to get that information out more broadly. And I'm going to talk a little bit here about kind of what you want to share, but it definitely depends directly on your audience, as well as your purpose or goal. So your board of directors, they're going to want probably all of the information, but you want to provide a focused discussion with them on key findings. Community members, you're probably going to want to keep this somewhat brief, focus on the key findings. Community members like, of course, to know about various community resources, so any data related to that, as well as recommendations. So like, how do we go forward from here together? Then community action network and staff. Oftentimes whenever we share things across the network as examples or promising, practices of data collection and sharing, it can be helpful to see the full report. Especially with staff, though, you want to provide some focus to it because, we don't have time oftentimes to read the full report. It might not make sense. So especially for staff and where we want to target what they should get out of it and how to use it, that's where you'll want to provide some focus. Potential funders, here you want to keep it more brief, but you do want to focus in on the recommendations because that's what they're going to want to fund. Elected officials, this is where you want to keep it real short, visual, but eye-catching, so that it really does get their attention among all the other things. And then news media. So it can be helpful a lot of times to share, especially data elements of poverty related to timely events in the community. So if you can kind of tie it back to what's happening in the community and that's going to catch people's attention, that can be helpful. Press releases is one good way to do that. And then for anyone, infographics, visuals, bite-sized pieces are very helpful. We live in a very information-heavy world. I mean, there is information and data and everything coming at us from all different angles, from all different formats. And so to get attention, it's going to have to be simple. It's going to have to keep the conversation going. And you want to provide the context. So just simply providing data and numbers is, sometimes will fall a little bit flat. But if you're able to contextualize it with customer success stories, or even if it's not necessarily a success, but stories, that can really help to kind of get the attention and get to the meaning, where it makes meaning for people. And when, so when and where is also important. Obviously, you're going to have lots of data in your community assessment, but making sure you share your community assessment. So it definitely should not be just submitted to the funder and then stop. There's pieces of it, and a full report should be posted to your website. There's pieces of it that can be pulled out and made into infographics, fairly easily. If you don't have someone on staff that can do all the kind of communications, graphics type stuff, sometimes you can find, interns or people at a local college or university who are looking for small projects like that. Community action plan, strategic plan, obviously your data should be used within your plans. So that's an opportunity for your data to be utilized as well. Grant writing, of course, you want to make sure you're using your data in there. For building partnerships to provide that evidence base of why do we need to work together, and then advocacy. So obviously with advocacy, kind of providing that that why to whatever action you're asking of someone. Where, of course, website, social media, community and advocacy meetings, taking materials to them and distributing it. You might even take it to partner organizations, depending on if there's short infographics that you want distributed. There's lots of different ways you can get these out and lots of different formats that you can get your information and data out as well. And then another example of something that in the last couple of years we've kind of provided more support and energy around in the network is around creating kind of your impact report, or not just an annual report of what your agency offers or kind of the services and outputs, but really talking about what was the impact that your organization had. And so we created a national impact report a couple of years ago, and it did what we just talked about on a previous slide, where we really contextualized the data with the stories. And so if you go to this link, and we'll provide you with these slides, there is a whole suite of resources associated with our National Impact Report. In addition to, you can simply look at our impact report, where you can take the National Impact Report and adapt it to your local agency. So Economic Security Corporation out of Joplin, Missouri did a nice job of this past year, where they kind of use the same format of using the numbers and the statistics and data with the stories that are happening within their local community. So that's one potential resource on communicating your data and impact. All right, so I've definitely talked enough at you all. So I'm not seeing any specific questions, I think, in the chat. I think the one question I have seen a few times is just people asking if the PowerPoint or recording will be available. And so yes, we will be providing a PDF of the slides on our website, as well as a recording of today's webinar. Usually that's posted within a couple of days of the event. If you are having trouble finding it, it should be on our website under Resource Library, then you go to Webinars. But if you have any trouble finding it, you can contact us at the partnership. You can just email me, and my information will be on the last slide. So if there are any other questions, feel free to type them in the chat. And I'm going to go ahead and share a few of our resources while you're doing that, and then I'll check the chat again. So one resource that especially related to data that can be very helpful is our, it's had a few names over time. It's our Community Needs Assessment online data tool, basically. But what the name of it now is the CAP Engagement Network. Previously, this tool was called Community Commons, but it is essentially the same tool. It just went through a little bit of a facelift and was transitioned to a different platform, essentially. But all the same great tools and functionality of it. Actually, there's been, within the last year or two, there's been a couple enhancements that have been done to it. Not only do we have the community assessment portion of the tool that you can print out a report with a wide variety of data indicators, but there's also a housing assessment report in there as well that has a broad array of housing indicators. So you can have a more specific report, especially if your agency has a large program around that, or that it's a need where you might be building more programming tied to housing. So there's actually, as a part of this tool, there's lots of charts and graphs and dials in there, so that can be helpful with communicating your data. So you're able to, export it all into like a Word document or PDF. You can clip out the different graphics and use those in other ways, so you don't have to keep it in the same format. And then there's also a mapping tool, so that can really help to visually represent your data across your geographic service location. So I encourage you to check that out. There are some pre-made maps if you don't know where to start. But then you can also get in there and just type in, whatever data you might be looking for to map over your service area. You can layer multiple data elements. So if you have any, you do have to create a login. If you have any issues, you can email us. And we'll be doing actually a session at our annual convention in a couple of months at the end of August, early September, that is going to be focused around data using this tool, especially around race and ethnicity demographic data. Then we have our Community Action Academy, which is our online learning management system on the Moodle platform. This is where you can find, I mentioned a few times that there's further training on data collection, data analysis, specifically this e-course on data collection, analysis, and use within our Roma Next Generation training series is where you're going to find a lot deeper information in these different topics. So that can also be found on our website if you go under our resource library, but there is a specific e-course on Community Action Academy related to this topic. So you can just go to moodle.communityactionpartnership.com, and it is free to create an account. The Roma Resource Guide, lots of good stuff in there. This is actually where some of those trainings I just showed are located on our website, and you can find that through our organizational standards webpage. We also have a group I just want to make you aware of in the network, and this is through our CARES Act TNTA project. And it's focused around a data ambassadors cohort. And so we have pulled together a few data professionals across the network. And current membership, you can see here on the screen, we might be looking to add another 1 or 2 experts that we're talking to. But they really provide kind of a high level guidance to agencies in the network to increase problem solving, innovation, and continuous improvement in their practices. So really, these people are from data-centric organizations that are really kind of living out a good data strategy and are able to kind of get together and learn and share out what they're learning and doing across the network as well. So there's going to be some information shared at the annual convention in Boston at it'd be August 30th through September 3rd. There's also a virtual component to that as well. And I probably should have had a slide on it too, but it's on our website under the events tab. All right, and then as far as upcoming training goes, just want to make you aware, like I mentioned in the beginning, we do have a couple of webinars that we're building out kind of as a part of this overall series related to online data dashboards. So that'll focus more in on communicating your data in that format. We have a couple agencies that are doing really interesting work with online data dashboards. And then also one that we're planning around telling your CARES impact story. So building on a few things that I talked about today, and also, thinking about the fact that, okay, you submitted your CSBG annual report and your CARES report, but what now? How do we make sure that we're really telling the story about the impact that community action has had, with CARES dollars, with other funding, and as we've really pivoted and responded during this pandemic. And then we're also in collaboration with ANSERT, the Association for Nationally Certified Roma Trainers. We're working on a measurement tool curriculum and training guide. So that'll be out late summer as well. And then always interested if there's anything else that would be helpful on data. So you can always email us or if you want to type in the chat with our last minute or so, we're always interested to hear that. So, and Aaron did provide, he's our Vice President for Organizational Capacity Building, typed in the annual convention link. So if you want to check that out, feel free to do so. And this is our contact information for the Center of Excellence team. You heard from Taylor at the very beginning, but then also Aaron and myself, any of us can be helpful to you. We always open to do that. So I don't see any other questions, so I'll let you all get back to it. And thank you all for your time today, and hope you have a great rest of your week.